true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. Now, what he means by incredible is not fantastic. It is fantastic, but literally, in is the negation, incredible is belief, right? A creed is a belief. Incredible would mean unbelievable. It's just so preposterous, nobody can believe in special creation. And so evolution stands not because it's coherent, logical, and evidential. It's because we just don't like this idea of special creation, right? Royce Rensberger, he's an anti-creationist, says this: at this point, it is necessary to reveal a little inside information about how scientists work, something the textbooks don't usually tell you. The fact is, the scientists are not really as objective and dispassionate in their work as they would like you to think. Most scientists first get their ideas about how the world works, not through rigorous logical processes, but through hunches and wild guesses. As individuals, they often come to believe something to be true long before they assemble the hard evidence that will convince someone else that it is. Motivated by faith, and that emphasis is mine, it's not in the article, in his own ideas and a desire for acceptance by his peers, a scientist will labor for years, knowing in his heart that his theory is incorrect, but devising experiment after experiment whose result he hopes will support his position. Right? Dan?
Couldn't you argue that an atheist scientist is also a creationist, but they believe in self-creation rather than creation by an all-powerful being?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, at least in some version of creation, we'll be dealing with that, Lord willing, even today. Seeing how that plays out. So everyone has a view of how life came into being, or how the universe came into being. So there is a creative element. Just who and how that came about is where the difference is. Right? Okay, so I don't know how many of you have ever seen the movie Expelled by Ben Stein. Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. It's really worth seeing if you haven't seen it, where he goes into the universities and he interviews professors and he asks some deep questions of people about science and why there's sort of this, an avoidance of the supernatural being a possibility. It's just very interesting. It's like we just aren't going to trouble ourselves with those sorts of premises and so forth. And, looks at how ideas have shaped the world, even looking at the Holocaust Museum and so forth, where atheism has brought about just the kind of atrocities in this world versus where Christianity really has promoted peace and life and prosperity. Yeah.
Watch that on Friday night here sometime.
That'd be a good idea. All right, why don't you get that organized? Yeah, that's a great idea. I'd love to do that. Okay, R.E. Dickerson, in his Molecular Evolution, again, an anti-creationist, he says, we take the side of science in spite, and all these emphases are his, in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a presupposition, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to a material cause to create the apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Right? It's like, we don't like where our conclusions are leading us, but we certainly can't have this God thing come into the door. Okay, now I could heap up quotation after quotation after quotation like this. This is a small sample. To make that case, a book has been published by Henry Morris that is nothing but a catalog of quotations just like this from different journals, different sort of admissions on all sorts of things. I have another one that I have given to Danielle that's a thick book about this big. It's a smaller in size, a much smaller print, but the same type of thing, where the evolutionists are admitting contradictions, absurdities, random assertions, just arbitrariness, which, as we went through, that arbitrariness and contradictions are the death of a worldview. And just over and over and over, you see it in those quotations. So anyhow, so I don't want you to think this is it or that this is cherry picking. You can read through at will and find this is not a made up point that I want to emphasize. Scientists have their faith commitments. Yeah, Josiah.
Just this week I heard a quote that Stephen Jay Gould, he's like the leading paleontologist
Yeah.
in the 70s, and he said,
That's right.
there's a quote, but he basically said, the evolutionary theory is not science, it's a metaphysic.
That's right.
And with Watson talking about it, he's saying it's a worldview. It's like you have to start with this to try and reason everything out. Yeah, and Stephen Jay Gould, if you're not familiar with him, he was out, not at Oxford, was he at Harvard? I think he's out at Harvard. But he's, one of the premier paleontologists. He was the one that came up with punctuated equilibrium. And we'll deal with that down the road here eventually. But he's one of the sharpest evolutionist, and what a buffoon at times, when he does admit things, but he's still trying to make this pig fly. Okay, so anyhow, so I think by the time we work through this material, you're going to see that those who boast of rationality, boast of logic, boast of science, and so forth, they're going to be the ones that have far greater faith commitments than the Christian has. They have far less rationality, far less observation of the claims they vaunt, even fabrication of hopelessly sought for evidences that then do the creationists. So the point here is that scientists have their faith commitment, and now the flip side of that, this science versus faith, those that claim science, we see have faith commitments. Now I want to go on the other side, which I think sometimes creationists, we tend to buy into that little dichotomy, and we tend to think, well, I have faith. My creation view is on faith, but I really don't have science to back that up. And this is what I want to strengthen in this course, is the kind of science that is in our camp, the kind of, sink your teeth into this kind of scientific evidence and rationality and so forth. So I want to make that abundantly clear in this. Creationists have big concerns over the challenges and dissatisfaction with naturalistic claims of the atheistic evolutionary community. So let's start with this thought. Can materialism solve the issues that are at hand if we assume this is nothing more than a material universe, nothing but physical things? Is materialism capable of addressing everything that we know and experience in the world? So I have here, materialism is a philosophy that undergirds most scientific thought, but it is not something that is scientifically tested, right?
Is materialism as a philosophy, is that something you can scientifically test? No, the philosophy itself is not science, right? That is a faith commitment. So, as a philosophy, I think it fails miserably. Materialism gives man a professed excuse for denying God. However, with the denial of immaterial things comes a host of problems. Now, why do people go to materialism? Well, they say, well, if I can see this world as nothing but matter in motion, well, then I don't have to worry about spirit things like a soul that could be judged to hell or a God that would judge people to hell, right? So if I deny the spiritual realm, the immaterial realm, I can get out of that conundrum or that uncomfortable thought. But with that denial of the immaterial, you've got a lot of problems. Because even in the statement, matter in motion, is that a physical substance? Could you get me 5 pounds of motion? Right? Matter in motion, that phrase has an immaterial component, even though they use that to argue for nothing but physical things. In the great debate, Greg Bahnsen debated the president of the Atheist Society, Gordon Stein. You can find that on cmfnow.com. It's also on for free on Sermon Audio. But I don't think it's listed as the great debate. But if you do Greg Bahnsen and do debates, you'll be able to find it in there. But he exposed to Gordon Stein, who was a material atheist, that he couldn't even account for the debate itself because Gordon Stein had come to that debate wanting to debate Christianity versus atheism, and wanted to use the laws of logic to make his case, and the laws of logic are immaterial in nature, so how could he actually win a debate when he denies in using laws of logic, he's using something immaterial to make his case for a material world? And so it was a wonderful debate if you've never heard that. But think of these other things. Is love a reality? Is there such a real thing as love in this world? We talk about it. We function as if there's love. We experience it. Is love real, or is that just a figment of our imagination? What about beauty? Morals. Our morals, ethics, are those material in nature? The mind. Now notice, I have in parentheses, not the brain. I'm not talking about the gray matter in our skull, not that physical organ. I'm talking about the mind, the conscientious interaction with things. Is our mind physical? Yeah. We could go on. Souls. Language. Think about the language I'm using right now to communicate to you. Is that physical in nature? Is language something that's physical? Numbers, right? Are numbers physical? We're not talking about the symbols we write on pieces of paper or computers, but the concept of what that number represents. Two-ness or four-ness, seven-ness, right? Is that material in nature? Elasticity, personal identity over time, right? You could look at your baby picture and say, that's me. And you look at your pictures from today, and there's some changes that have taken place over time, haven't there? But it's still you. Is that personal identity something that is material? Beliefs, radiation, class concepts, right? I'm a human being. You're a human being. At least I think you are. Could be an alien. You're a human being. You're a human being. But there's a class of human beings, right? So is the class concept between, we have pews here, right? That pew looks very much like that pew, but it's different. And those pews in the back are different than the chairs, and those couple that are different pews are still considered in the class of pews. And we're not talking about the pew itself, but to say that thing and these things, even though there's some differences, they still fit within a class, as a class concept material. You see, we can go on and on. There's so many things in this world that are not material, that materialism as a foundation to atheistic science is debunked categorically. It is illogical, irrational. It is not what we live by. No man can live without immaterial things. So the basic assumption is faulty. Now, we can hang up this whole study and be done right now. Because atheistic science cannot account for everything in this world on a materialistic assumption. Now, not every scientist is going to be woodenly, hard and fast materialist. So let's go on. Are there other weaknesses that we can find? Let's talk about the Big Bang. Is the Big Bang really a science understanding? How do we understand this? Is this an experiment that we could put up in our laboratory and repeat it over and over and try to find out if we get the same result each time? Or is this a faith commitment? Was anybody there to witness this? Obviously, the Big Bang is a modern theory, probably less than 100 years old, maybe 100 years old or so. Was anybody who's alive in the last 100 years a witness to the Big Bang? So it's not something that we've experienced. It's not something we could repeat. It's a conjecture about a historical event. And now, if we're going to be scientific, ought not our science to comport with other sciences, to fit and mesh with the other scientific processes and disciplines? And so we want to say, well, we have a law. Newton's law of motion is that objects at rest stay at rest, and objects in motion stay in motion unless another force acts upon them. So if you have this point of singularity that was static, what changed its state into motion? Newton's law of motion is violated in the Big Bang theory without an outside force. So some Christians are going to say, hey, I know a force, because I'm not willing to be a materialist. I'm going to insert God at that point and say, I believe God used a Big Bang, and that all of the science can come in now, and I can make God the outside force, and now I've got the answer. And that may be a plausible start. But in and of itself, without some outside force, it violates known scientific laws. Okay, so let's say, well, maybe those laws came into being because of the Big Bang. They come post-Big Bang, right? Okay, let's just grant them that this Big Bang could actually get started. Okay, how would we get the condensation of stars in a Big Bang? If you look at the forces of attraction versus repulsion in an expanding gas cloud, the repulsion factor between particles is 100 times greater between particles in an expanding gas cloud than the attraction force. So what's the likelihood you would ever have the condensation of these massive planets in an expanding gas cloud? Okay, let's just say, well, okay, it's possible. Maybe we do get this condensation, and that, things, 1 in 100, yeah, maybe you would get these random things, but you have just vacuous, just empty space, and then these planets so far away from each other that you don't have these kind of dust clouds and more clumps somewhere. It's just very empty and just solid planets. Okay, fourth problem, and this one is where I believe things really get heated up, so to speak, really get ramped up. The problem of abiogenesis. How many of you know what abiogenesis is without looking at the notes? Raise your hand. You could almost break that down. Just, I tell the children, abiogenesis. Well, Genesis is the beginning, bio is life, and the alpha is a negation. So without life, beginning, or life from non-life, life before life. How do you get living things from inorganic, inanimate substances? How do rocks bring life to bacteria? Remember how Louis Pasteur had rejected spontaneous generation, that spontaneous generation is unscientific. He found the cause to why rats can come from an old cloth and wheat and things like that, bacteria and so forth. George Wald from Harvard University, a biochemist, and had received the Nobel Prize, said this: "One only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet here we are. As a result, I believe of spontaneous generation." This is absolutely impossible that you could get this. But I believe we're here because of an impossibility. Now, you're probably familiar with Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, the famous Miller-Urey experiment, which was a gas chamber that was heated up with some gases, that ammonia and so forth, that was believed to be the primordial atmosphere, that was heated up to get some vapors. The vapors would go through the apparatus into another chamber where there was sparks that were stimulating lightning in that primordial atmosphere. And then a precipitate was captured down in the bottom, a little trap door that after a while you could open up the little stopcock, and that liquid was drained out, and it was observed that there were 5 definite amino acids that were discovered, and 2 that were very faint hints at 2 possible other amino acids that had been developed. And this experiment was wildly received as proof that life could come from inorganic matter. Famously. Now, the problem with the Stanley Miller Urey, the Miller-Urey experiment was that in life, that trapdoor would not exist. That those amino acids don't have a way of being extracted out of the system and protected. What was done is that removing that trapdoor and circulating that precipitate back into the environment, the lightning destroyed those amino acids as well. So what was created was then destroyed. And so you would have to protect those amino acids somehow in almost like this intelligent intervention and save those from the hostile environment of that lightning. So the experiment wasn't really actually fair to the reality of this world. There were other problems that are going to arise in that, but this idea of a living cell forming spontaneously, when George Wald says this is an impossibility, it is that idea that I really want to drive into your consciences, if I can, of just how astronomically impossible this is going to be. So I want to make a pitch, but I want to do a long wind-up, okay? So I want you to stay with me. And I want to illustrate something about how numbers work. You children, have you ever been offered this scenario in life? If I were to say, I'll give you a penny if you work for me today, I'll employ you for a month, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to double your wages every day, but I'll only employ you for a month. Would you take the job? You would? Would you? Got 2 to 1? Would you take it, Eli? Would you take it? You would? You'd be smart boys. Very smart. Because at the end of the month, you would have over $5 million. $5 million if I doubled from a penny, just doubled it, in 30 rotations, $5,368,709.12 to be exact. That'd be worth working for a month, wouldn't it? You wouldn't have to work after that, probably. Okay, same scenario. This time I'll pay you a penny, but I'm going to give you 10 times that penny and employ you for a month. How much do you think you would have if I did it that way? Any guesses? It's in the alphabet? Yeah, that's right. If you read a little ahead, you get the answers, don't you? You'd be an octillionaire. Now, what's an octillionaire? You have a millionaire. You would be a millionaire at doubling, right? You have $5 million. Then you have trillionaires. Then you have quadrillionaires, pentillionaires, hextillionaires, heptillionaires, and then octillionaires. And each one is 1,000 bigger. An octillionaire would have, if you were a trillionaire, an octillionaire would have $1 trillion for every penny that a trillionaire has. That's how big that number is. So when you look at what an octillion is, that's a huge number. That's a 1 to the 27th power. That's 27 digit places. Okay, that's an octillion. Now, the number of electrons in this ball of space, estimated to be, 10 billion light years in diameter. The number of electrons in that ball of space is estimated to be 1 followed by 60 digit places. Okay, 60, some varying views. I've seen it 27 digit places to 80, but let's say 60-ish as an average. If you had 1 followed by 61 digit places, you'd have 10 balls of space, the electrons in that. And then if you had 1 followed by 62 digits, you'd have 100 of those balls, and it would go exponential to an octillion of those if you had 30 iterations of that, 30 places out, right? 90 digit places would be an octillion balls of space with those tiny little electrons in it. Do you see how numbers work? Okay, I've set you up for understanding how these digit places work, how fast they go, how big they get, because I want to read you a quote by Sir Fred Hoyle, who you're probably more familiar with a different quote where he said, the odds of life forming randomly out of a chaos would be like throwing a bomb into a junkyard and having a fully functional 747 come out of that. You're probably familiar with that. This, I think, is a better quote from him. Listen to this quote. He said, he's a British astronomer and mathematician, calculated the odds of one simple bacteria arising from a primordial soup. He assumed that all 20 amino acids were present in the soup, contrary to the Miller-Urey experiment, which yielded only 7 of the simplest amino acids, giving the best read on that. Those 2 were speculative. A simple bacterium is composed of 2,000 different functioning proteins. In turn, each protein consists of a chain of about 300 amino acids. There are 20 distinct amino acids, so the odds of one proteinated amino acid occurring in the correct sequence is 1 in 20. The odds of 300 occurring in the correct sequence is 1 in 300 to the 20th power. Hoyle realized that there can be some variation in the exact sequence, so the odds would be reduced to 1 in 10 to the 20th power. But because there must be 20 different functioning proteins, the odds of the spontaneous generation of a cell is 1 in 10 to the 20th times 2,000th power gives you 10 to the 40,000th power. That's a number 1 with 40,000 zeros behind it. Even ignoring the problems beyond the math, such a counterproductive effect that individual essential chemical components have upon each other the inability to create all 20 amino acids under simulated conditions, abiogenesis is impossible. That's right. Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, so you'll see Jim Carrey. So what you're saying? I explained this number to somebody, and he argued that it's not impossible because it's 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. Now, what I'm saying is that number is so astronomical, you can't get your mind around how big that is. So you have right-handed and left-handed amino acids, and if you have a chain of 200 amino acids and 199 of them are all in a, let's say, I don't know what this look like, left or right-handed orientation. If you have one that is in the opposite orientation, life is impossible. So half of those random amino acids will cause death. You have to get all of those 200 in exactly the same order with the chain of 300 amino acids to get a functioning protein strand. And that is only one basic part of a living cell. It's just the genetic structure. The cell is vastly complex. The odds of abiogenesis happening is just absolutely impossible. That's not an overstatement. It's ridiculous. So anyhow, so let's give them abiogenesis. Let's just say, okay, maybe somehow all of these things came together and you miraculously got life from non-life. How do you move from this bacteria that is a self-replicating bacteria from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction? We're dealing now with how do you get from bacteria to elephants, right? Now remember, Darwin's theory of natural selection argued for 5 principles for successful speciation. He said, number 1, organisms have to produce more offspring than are actually surviving. 2, every organism must struggle to survive. 3, there is a variation within species. 4, some variations allow members of species to survive and reproduce better than others. And 5, organisms that survive and reproduce pass their traits to their offspring, and the helpful traits gradually appear in more and more of the population. Okay, so, in a sense, Darwin's been accused of saying, well, how do you know which species is the successful species? He says, well, the one that is able to reproduce its offspring the most effectively. Well, how do you know which one produces their offspring most effectively? Well, it's the one that survives. So how do you know which is the successful species? It's the one who survives. Which is the one that's going to survive? The one that survives. It's a circular sort of way of reasoning. I think he's guilty of that. But let's look at bacteria. Bacteria, how does it fit these 5 things? Organisms must produce more offspring than actually survive. Is bacteria pretty good at that? Producing more offspring than survive? I mean, massive amounts of offspring, right? I mean, they self-replicate. There's no end to the amount of offspring they can give, right? So they would get an A+ on that. Every organism must struggle to survive. What about bacteria? I mean, sometimes bacteria live for a few seconds or a few minutes, maybe a day or two, but stress to an environment would be very difficult, probably, in most cases, to have the long-term effects. But, okay, what if, we could maybe give it a C. I don't know, I put an F-, that stress to, maybe they're born into a stressful environment. Number 3, there's variation within a species. Okay, so bacteria, is there a lot of variation within bacteria? Yeah, lots of variation. So it would satisfy that pretty easily. 4, some variation allows members of species to survive and reproduce better than others. Okay, sure. Mutant varieties of bacteria are stronger, perhaps. Actually, you ought to know, I only have 2 minutes, but you ought to know that there's been studies on bacteria mutating, and there's a school of thought that's arising that is really saying bacteria doesn't actually mutate. But what we're seeing is if you have a bacteria that's prevalent, and you'll view this and see a particular bacteria, it keeps weaker strains at bay. And when you kill off that main bacteria, weaker ones that were kept at bay tend to propagate now without that stronger bacteria. And actually a weaker bacteria comes to prominence. And it's not that one bacteria mutated in order to survive, as if it had intelligence, right? So that is a possible explanation of what we're viewing in, quote, these mutated strains of bacteria. Okay, so organisms survive that reproduce, pass their traits to their offspring, and the helpful traits gradually appear more and more in the population. 5, bacteria should be very voluminous, varied, and hardy. So again, very, very good. So bacteria, on Darwin's view, should have really no need to mutate into things different and would have a great survivability. But now think about how elephants are going to fit this model. Do elephants, are they able to reproduce more offspring than survive? They obviously are able to grow a herd, but very, very slowly, right? Like a